The Runaways. Chapter 1. The Encounter. The diner was quiet, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened until she walked in. Laura Stevens, a petite woman with short dark hair, entered like a gust of wind, bringing a sense of urgency with her. She slid into the booth at the far end, away from the windows, scanning the room nervously. Her eyes darted to the man sitting alone at the counter, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a worn leather jacket. His name was Jack Miller, and in that moment, their paths crossed, sealing a fate neither could escape. Jack was no stranger to trouble. A few minor thefts, a couple of bar fights, but nothing that could prepare him for what was about to unfold. Laura was different. She had the look of someone running from something bigger than a bad break. Jack couldn't take his eyes off her as she glanced over, her gaze locking with his for a brief second before quickly looking away. He wasn't sure what made him stand up, walk over to her table, and sit down across from her. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, or maybe it was the way she carried herself, like a woman with secrets too dangerous to reveal. "You waiting for someone?" Jack asked, his voice low but filled with curiosity. Laura hesitated before answering. "Not anymore." She looked around the diner again, checking if anyone had noticed them. No one did. The waitress behind the counter was too busy cleaning up, and the other customers were lost in their own worlds. It felt like the universe had shrunk to just the two of them, an unspoken tension rising between them. "Who are you running from?" Jack's voice softened, but the weight of the question hung in the air. Laura glanced down, fidgeting with the napkin in her hand. "That's not something I can tell a stranger." Jack leaned back, giving her space but not letting her off the hook. "I'm not a stranger." "Not anymore." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Laura Stevens. "And you're right. I'm running. From everything." Jack could see the desperation in her eyes, the kind that spoke of someone who'd crossed a line they could never come back from. And as if something clicked in his mind, Jack knew this wasn't a woman running from a bad boyfriend or a lousy job. This was something else. Something far more dangerous. "Mind if I join you in that run?" Jack asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Laura looked at him, surprised, unsure if he was serious. But deep down, she knew she needed someone like him. Someone who didn't ask too many questions, someone willing to ride the storm with her. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. "Okay, but once you're in, there's no going back." Jack chuckled, leaning forward. "That's the idea." Excited for what comes next? Subscribe and share to uncover the dangerous path Laura and Jack will take. Chapter 2. The Heist. 2 weeks later, Jack found himself behind the wheel of a beat-up sedan, hands clenched around the steering wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear but from the adrenaline surging through his veins. Next to him, Laura stared ahead, her jaw tight, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. They were parked outside a small bank on the edge of town, a place that didn't look like much but held enough cash to fund their getaway for weeks. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, glancing at Laura. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the bank's front doors. "It's the only way, Jack. We can't keep running without money. We need this." Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the idea any easier to stomach. Robbing a bank wasn't something you just did on a whim. But Laura had a plan, and he trusted her. That trust, however, was starting to feel like a ticking bomb. He'd gotten in too deep with her, and every day brought them closer to the edge. "All right," Jack muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's do this." Laura pulled a mask from her jacket, a simple black bandana she tied around her face. Jack did the same, then reached for the pistol she'd given him earlier. It felt heavy in his hands, foreign, like it didn't belong to him. But he couldn't think about that now. They had a job to do. 5 minutes, Laura said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. In and out, no mistakes. Jack nodded, stepping out of the car as Laura did the same. They moved quickly, their feet crunching on the gravel parking lot as they approached the bank's side entrance. Laura had scoped out the place for days. She knew the guards' shifts, when the tellers took their lunch breaks, and even the weak spot in the bank's security system. It was as flawless a plan as they could manage, but even the best plans had cracks. They slipped through the side door, the cool air of the bank's interior hitting them as they entered. The bank was small, just a few tellers behind glass windows and one guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Laura moved with purpose, her eyes sharp, her body tense. She drew her gun and aimed it at the ceiling, firing a shot that echoed through the small space. "Everyone on the ground," she shouted. Screams erupted as the customers and staff hit the floor. The guard hesitated, but when Laura turned the gun on him, his hands shot up and he dropped to his knees. Jack's heart raced as he moved behind the counter, shoving a black duffel bag toward one of the tellers. "Fill it up," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. The teller, a woman in her 50s, shook as she began stuffing the bag with stacks of cash. Jack's mind raced, counting down the seconds in his head. They didn't have much time before the silent alarm would be tripped. "Move faster," Laura growled, keeping her gun trained on the room. Jack glanced at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. She was in control, but barely. This was the part of Laura he didn't fully understand, the part that was willing to do whatever it took to stay ahead of the law, to keep running. And now, he was a part of it. The teller finished filling the bag, and Jack grabbed it, slinging it over his shoulder. "Let's go," he shouted to Laura. But just as they turned to leave, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Jack's stomach dropped. The alarm had been tripped faster than they'd anticipated. "Out the back!" Laura yelled, and they sprinted for the exit. Bursting through the back door, they ran toward the car. Jack could see flashing lights in the distance, the police closing in faster than he'd thought. They jumped into the car, and Jack slammed the gas pedal down, tires screeching as they tore out of the parking lot. "Did we get enough?" Jack asked, his voice strained as they sped down the highway. Laura looked down at the bag of cash, then back up at him, a sly smile creeping across her face. "More than enough." Jack couldn't help but grin, even as the sirens grew louder behind them. For now, they were in the clear. But how long could they keep running before everything came crashing down? Enjoying the thrill so far? Subscribe and share to see how Jack and Laura's escape plan unravels in the next chapter. Chapter 3. The Getaway. The car tore down the highway, the flashing red and blue lights growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, his heart pounding against his chest. Laura sat beside him, catching her breath, still clutching the bag of cash. The adrenaline was still pumping, but the tension between them was palpable. "Where to now?" Jack asked, his voice strained as the engine roared beneath them. "South," Laura replied, staring out the window. "We need to get as far away from this town as possible. There's a place we can lay low, but it'll take a few hours to get there." Jack nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The heist had been chaotic, but they had made it out. Barely. His hands shook as he tried to steady the wheel, focusing on the open road ahead. He could still hear the faint echo of the sirens, even though they were miles away now. Every instinct told him they were being chased. "Are you sure we lost them?" Jack asked, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see police cars tearing after them. "We lost them for now," Laura answered, her voice calm but clipped. "But they'll be looking for us soon enough. We need to disappear." "Disappear?" Jack scoffed, glancing at her. "We just robbed a bank, Laura. How exactly do you plan on disappearing?" She turned to face him, her eyes cold and calculating. "I have a plan, Jack. I told you, I always have a plan." He wanted to believe her. Laura had gotten them this far, after all. But as the minutes passed in silence, the weight of what they had done began to sink in. They were criminals now. More than just small-time thieves, they were wanted by the law, and there was no going back. "You never told me why you're doing this," Jack said after a while, his voice softer now, more curious than accusatory. "Why are you running?" Laura didn't respond right away. She looked out the window, her expression unreadable, like she was somewhere else entirely. Jack waited, the silence between them heavy and charged. "I didn't have a choice," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got involved with the wrong people. Made some mistakes. Now they're after me, and they won't stop until I'm either dead or gone for good." Jack frowned, his mind racing with questions. "Who's after you?" Laura hesitated, then shook her head. "You don't want to know, Jack. Trust me. It's bigger than both of us." He wanted to press her for more, but something in her tone stopped him. Jack had always been good at reading people, and he could tell when someone was hiding something dangerous. Whatever Laura was involved in, it was serious. Deadly serious. "So, what's the plan?" Jack asked, shifting gears. "We keep running until we vanish into thin air?" "That's the idea," Laura replied, her voice harder now, more resolute. "We lay low for a while, wait for the heat to die down. Then we figure out our next move. But whatever happens, we stick together. We're in this now. Both of us." Jack didn't respond, but deep down, he knew she was right. There was no turning back. He was all in. As the car sped through the desolate countryside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The tension between them eased slightly, but the weight of their actions still hung in the air. They drove for hours, the landscape blurring into a sea of darkness as night fell. Laura gave him directions in short, clipped sentences, leading them deeper into the rural south, far from any major cities. Eventually, they pulled off onto a dirt road that wound through a dense forest. The headlights cut through the trees, casting eerie shadows as they moved deeper into the woods. "Are you sure about this place?" Jack asked, his voice tense again as they bounced along the rough road. "It's safe," Laura assured him. "No one will find us here." They finally reached a small, rundown cabin nestled in the trees. It looked abandoned, the wood weathered and worn by years of neglect. Jack parked the car behind the cabin, hidden from the road. As they got out, Laura grabbed the bag of cash, her movements quick and efficient. Jack looked around, uneasy. The place felt too quiet, too isolated. But it was better than the alternative, being caught. "This is where we wait?" Jack asked as Laura led him inside. "For now," she replied, tossing the bag onto a dusty table. "We'll stay here until I can figure out our next move." Jack sighed, sitting down heavily in an old wooden chair. The weight of everything was starting to hit him all at once. The thrill of the heist had worn off, and now reality was sinking in. They were fugitives, hiding in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. And the worst part? Jack had no idea how this would end. Curious about what happens next? Subscribe and share to follow Jack and Laura's dangerous journey as they face new challenges. Chapter 4. Unseen Eyes. The cabin was eerily quiet. Jack paced the worn floorboards while Laura rifled through the duffel bag, counting the cash. The only sound came from the occasional rustling of leaves outside, and even that seemed unnerving in the stillness of the night. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that eyes hidden in the darkness were tracking their every move. "How much do we have?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Enough to disappear for a while," Laura said, not looking up from the stack of bills in her hands. "But not forever." Jack let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can live like this, Laura. Looking over my shoulder every second. It's exhausting." Laura stopped what she was doing, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were sharp, focused. She was still in survival mode, always calculating the next step. "We don't have a choice, Jack. This is the life now." Jack leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "And what happens when we run out of money? What then?" Laura didn't answer. She went back to counting the money, as if ignoring the question would make the problem disappear. But Jack knew it wouldn't. The clock was ticking, and no matter how far they ran, they couldn't outrun the inevitable. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Jack asked, his voice low. "Run. Hid. Stolen." Laura's fingers stilled on the cash. For a moment, it seemed like she might deny it, but then she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I've done what I had to do. I don't regret any of it." Jack frowned, studying her. Laura was a mystery, a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. He had known from the moment they met that she was dangerous, but now he was beginning to wonder just how deep her past went, and whether or not he was ready to face it. "You're not telling me everything," Jack said, stepping closer to her. "Who's after you, Laura? Why are we really running?" She stiffened, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up from the table, crossing the small room to the window. She peeked through the curtain, scanning the dark woods outside, her shoulders tense. "They're professionals," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they don't stop until they get what they want." Jack's heart sank. "Who are they?" Laura turned to face him, her eyes colder than ever. "You don't need to know their names, Jack. Just know that they're the kind of people you don't want to cross." Jack's chest tightened. He had thought they were running from the law, from the police. But this was something else. Something far more dangerous. "You got involved with them, didn't you?" Jack pressed, his voice harder now. "What did you do, Laura?" "I took something that wasn't mine," she admitted, her gaze unflinching. "And they want it back." Jack's mind raced. This was worse than he had imagined. Whoever they were ruthless. And now, because he had chosen to follow Laura, he was in just as deep. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Jack asked, anger bubbling up inside him. "I deserve to know what I'm up against." Laura stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "Because you wouldn't have come with me if you knew. And I needed you, Jack. I still do." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jack felt the weight of them settle in his chest. She was right. If he had known the truth from the start, he might have walked away. But now it was too late. He was in this, whether he liked it or not. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "So what's the plan now? We just hide here and hope they don't find us?" Laura shook her head. "No. They'll find us eventually. We need to be ready when they do." Jack didn't like the sound of that. He had never signed up for a showdown, but it seemed inevitable now. Whoever these people were, they were coming, and Jack had a sinking feeling they wouldn't stop until blood was spilled. Outside, a twig snapped. Jack froze, his eyes darting to the window. The darkness beyond the cabin felt more oppressive now, as if something was lurking just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Laura tensed, nodding slowly. She moved toward the table, reaching for her gun, her movements slow and deliberate. Jack grabbed his own weapon, his heart hammering in his chest. "Get the lights," Laura said softly. Jack flipped the switch, plunging the cabin into darkness. His pulse quickened as his eyes adjusted, the faint light of the moon casting long shadows through the windows. They stood still, listening, waiting. Another sound, closer this time. A footstep. Whoever was out there, they weren't trying to hide. "They found us," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's heart raced. He could feel the walls closing in around them. There was no escape now. Only the inevitable confrontation. Feeling the tension rise? Subscribe and share to find out who's waiting in the dark for Jack and Laura. Chapter 5. Closing in. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he strained to hear the faint sounds outside. Whoever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. They were coming. And fast. He exchanged a glance with Laura, who stood poised, her gun aimed at the door, every muscle in her body tense and ready. Jack's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but all he could feel was the weight of dread settling over him. There was no running this time. They were cornered. "How many do you think?" Jack whispered, barely audible in the thick darkness. Laura's eyes flicked toward him, but her answer was cold and matter-of-fact. "Doesn't matter. They're not here to talk." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps shifted. Whoever was outside was moving quickly around the cabin. Jack's pulse quickened, and he could feel the adrenaline building, clouding his thoughts. Laura turned toward the back door, her body moving instinctively. "Get ready," she murmured, her eyes sharp and focused. Jack swallowed hard, gripping his gun tighter. He had never been in a situation like this before. The bank job was one thing, but this was survival. These people didn't care about money or the law. They were here to kill. A loud thud against the back door sent Jack's heart into his throat. It was followed by another, louder thud. Someone was trying to break in. The thin wooden door wouldn't hold long. "Go to the window," Laura ordered in a low voice, motioning with her head. "If they break through, we'll need to divide their attention." Jack moved quickly, his mind spinning as he crouched near the window. He peered through a crack in the old wooden frame, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. All he could make out were the vague shapes of trees and shadows dancing under the pale moonlight. Then, another sound, a voice this time. Low, muffled, but unmistakable. "Come out, Laura," a man's voice called from outside. "We don't want to play games. Just hand it over." Jack's blood ran cold. Whoever these people were, they knew Laura by name. And whatever she had stolen from them, it was important enough for them to track her down here, in the middle of nowhere. Laura didn't respond. Her face was set in stone, her eyes locked on the back door as it creaked under the pressure of the assault. "They're not going away," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. "I know," Laura said softly. "That's why we need to make sure they don't get in." Another crash against the door, this one splintered the wood. Jack's grip tightened on his gun as he prepared himself for the inevitable. He could hear the footsteps now, closing in on all sides. Suddenly, a window shattered behind him. Glass sprayed across the floor, and Jack instinctively ducked, rolling to the side as a figure loomed through the broken window. The man was fast, vaulting through the opening with ease, his gun raised and ready. Jack's heart raced as he lifted his weapon, his hands trembling. He had never shot anyone before. But as the man advanced, there was no time to think. It was him or Jack. Bang! The sound of the gunshot echoed through the cabin, louder than anything Jack had ever heard. The man stumbled, clutching his side, but didn't go down immediately. Jack stared in shock as blood seeped through the man's shirt, his body swaying before collapsing to the floor with a heavy thud. Jack couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He had just shot someone. "Jack!" Laura's voice cut through the fog of his mind. "Focus." Jack blinked, forcing himself to snap out of it. There was no time to process what had just happened. More were coming. Laura fired a shot at the back door as it finally gave way, the wood splintering as another man burst inside. Her aim was quick, precise. One shot to the chest, and he crumpled to the ground before he could even lift his gun. "Stay sharp," Laura hissed, moving toward Jack. "There's more." Jack nodded, his body trembling, but he managed to pull himself to his feet. They weren't done yet. The footsteps outside hadn't stopped. Laura grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the front of the cabin. "We can't stay here. If we're pinned down, we're dead." Jack could barely hear her over the pounding in his ears, but he knew she was right. They needed to move. Fast. Back doors blown, Laura muttered, glancing around the cabin. We need to make a run for it. Stay close to me. Jack nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He followed Laura as she moved toward the front door, her gun held steady in her hand. She paused for a moment, listening for any signs of movement outside. The tension was unbearable. Then, with a single motion, she kicked the door open and sprinted outside into the night. Jack followed, his heart hammering as they ran through the darkness, the cool night air hitting his face like a shock. They ducked behind trees, moving as quickly and quietly as they could, knowing that any misstep could mean their lives. The forest was dense, the shadows deep and impenetrable. But Jack could hear the footsteps behind them, the men moving through the woods, hunting them down. We're not out of this yet, Laura whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. Stay close. Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. They had survived the cabin, but now they were being hunted through the trees. And he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. Want to see how Jack and Laura escaped their relentless pursuers? Subscribe and share to follow their next desperate move. Chapter 6. Into the shadows. The forest swallowed them whole. The towering trees cast shadows that seemed to stretch forever, creating a labyrinth of darkness. Jack's lungs burned as he ran, the cool air biting his skin, every step feeling heavier than the last. Laura moved ahead of him, swift and silent like she had been through these woods before. Jack struggled to keep up, his mind racing with the sound of footsteps behind them, the hunters closing in. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Survival was the only thing on their minds now. The sound of their pursuers grew louder, branches snapping, voices low but insistent. Jack could barely make out their words, but he knew what they meant. They were closing in, and fast. Keep moving. Laura hissed as she glanced back at him. Her eyes were sharp, focused, but Jack could see the tension in her face. She wasn't as in control as she seemed. Jack nodded, pushing himself harder, even as the weight of what they had done back at the cabin pressed down on him. He had shot a man. Maybe killed him. The image of the men falling, clutching his side, blood pouring from his wound, it haunted him. He had never imagined he'd be capable of something like that, and now that the moment had passed, it was hard to think about anything else. But there wasn't time to dwell on it. Not with death breathing down their necks. Up ahead. Laura pointed, her voice low but urgent. Through the trees, Jack could see the faint outline of a stream. The water shimmered in the moonlight, a narrow path cutting through the thick woods. We can use the stream to cover our tracks, Laura explained, her breath coming in quick bursts. If we lose them in the water, we might have a chance. Jack didn't argue. He followed her down the steep incline toward the water, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. When they reached the edge of the stream, Laura motioned for him to step into the shallow water. It was freezing, the cold biting through his shoes and into his skin, but he didn't complain. It was their best shot at throwing off their pursuers. They waded through the stream, moving as quietly as possible. The water barely reached their ankles, but every step felt like a struggle against the current. Jack's heart raced, every splash of water sounding louder than it should, like a beacon announcing their presence. He kept glancing back, expecting to see the shadows of their hunters, guns drawn, ready to finish the job. But the forest behind them remained still. For now. Laura's breathing was labored, but she kept moving, her eyes scanning the trees on the other side of the stream. If we can make it past the bend, she whispered, we can lose them. There's a clearing up ahead where we can hide. Jack nodded, though his body screamed for rest. His legs ached, his chest felt tight, but he pushed on. The alternative was worse. If they stopped now, they were dead. The stream bent sharply, and as they rounded the corner, the trees gave way to an open clearing. The moonlight bathed the small meadow in an eerie silver glow, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful in a way, but to Jack, It felt like a trap, too open, too exposed. "We need to cross fast," Laura muttered, her eyes scanning the tree-line. "Once we're across, we can." A loud crack echoed through the night. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the sound of a twig snapping or a branch breaking underfoot. It was the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. "Get down!" Laura screamed, grabbing Jack and pulling him to the ground. They hit the dirt just as another shot rang out, this one closer, the bullet whizzing past them and striking a tree nearby. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears as he scrambled to cover, pressing his body against the ground, trying to make himself as small as possible. "They're here," Laura hissed, her voice laced with fear and anger. She pulled her gun from her waistband, her eyes darting around, trying to locate their attackers. "We need to move. Now." Jack nodded, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His hands shook, his breath came in ragged gasps. He had never been in a firefight before, and the sheer terror of it had frozen him in place. He could feel the panic rising, threatening to choke him. "Jack, come on." Laura grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We have to go." But before they could move, another shot rang out, this one hitting the ground near Jack's feet, kicking up dirt and rocks. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. Laura fired back into the trees, her aim steady despite the chaos. "Go," she shouted, pushing Jack toward the tree-line. "I'll cover you." Jack didn't think. He just ran. His feet pounded against the earth as he sprinted toward the safety of the trees, the sound of gunfire echoing behind him. He could hear Laura firing, each shot quick and controlled, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he threw himself behind a tree, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He pressed his back against the rough bark, trying to catch his breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, silence. No more gunfire. No more footsteps. Jack held his breath, listening. The forest around him was still. Too still. He peered around the tree, searching for Laura, but she wasn't where he had left her. Panic surged through him. Had they hit her? Had she? "Jack!" Her voice cut through the silence, low but insistent. He turned and saw her crouched behind a fallen log a few yards away, her eyes scanning the trees. "They're gone. For now." He exhaled, the relief washing over him like a wave. But it didn't last long. They were still being hunted, still on the run. And now, their enemies knew exactly where they were. "We need to keep moving," Laura said, her voice trembling just slightly. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't miss." Can Jack and Laura outsmart their hunters in the deadly chase through the woods? Subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat. Chapter 7. No Way Out. The forest felt like a maze of shadows as Jack and Laura pressed forward, moving as fast as their bodies would allow. Every step was a struggle, their muscles burning, their breath coming in short gasps. The sound of gunfire had stopped, but the threat lingered, hanging over them like a storm waiting to strike. "They're regrouping," Laura muttered as they weaved through the trees. Her voice was calm, but Jack could sense the urgency beneath it. "They'll come back with more men." Jack's mind raced, trying to keep up with everything that had happened. The gunfight, the chase, the fact that they were being hunted like animals, it all seemed unreal. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, and yet here he was, running through the woods with a woman he barely knew, his future uncertain. "How much farther?" Jack asked, glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see their pursuers emerging from the darkness. Laura hesitated, her eyes scanning the trees ahead. "Not far. There's an old barn up ahead, abandoned. We can hide there until we figure out our next move." Jack wasn't convinced. Hiding had gotten them nowhere so far, and now it seemed like they were out of options. But he had no better plan, and trusting Laura was his only choice. They moved quickly, the trees thinning as they approached the edge of the forest. Just as Laura had said, a dilapidated barn loomed ahead, its weathered wooden beams barely holding it together. It was nestled in the middle of a large clearing, surrounded by open fields. There was nowhere to hide once they reached it. No cover, no escape routes. If they were found here, it would be the end. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low, unsure. Laura didn't answer right away. She seemed to be weighing her options, but then she nodded, her jaw tight. "It's our best shot." Jack's stomach churned with doubt, but he followed her across the clearing, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. They reached the barn and slipped inside, the old wooden door creaking on its rusted hinges. The air inside was thick with the smell of rotting wood and dust, the beams overhead sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Laura wasted no time. She moved to the far corner of the barn, crouching low behind an overturned pile of hay bales. Jack followed, his heart pounding in his chest, every nerve in his body on edge. "They'll come," Laura whispered, her eyes locked on the barn's entrance. "And when they do, we'll have to fight." Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't built for this kind of life. But it was too late to back out now. "You're sure we can't just keep running?" Jack asked, his voice barely audible. Laura's eyes flicked to his, her expression hard. "There's nowhere left to run, Jack. This is it." Jack didn't know what to say. He could see the fear in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. She had been running for so long, always one step ahead, always surviving. But now, it seemed like the walls were closing in. There was no way out. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps reached Jack's ears. His heart skipped a beat. The hunters were close. Too close. He could feel it. Laura tensed beside him, her grip tightening on her gun. She motioned for Jack to stay low, her eyes scanning the entrance, waiting for the inevitable. The footsteps grew louder. Jack's pulse quickened. Any moment now, they would burst through the door, guns blazing, and it would be over. He tried to steady his breathing, tried to calm the panic rising in his chest, but it was no use. This was it. The door creaked open. Jack froze, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure stepping into the barn. It was one of the men from before, his gun raised, his eyes scanning the room. He moved cautiously, as if sensing the danger lurking within. Laura didn't move. She waited, her breath steady, her finger resting on the trigger of her gun. Jack could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm hits. The men took another step, and then, bang! Laura fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the barn like thunder. The man staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock before he collapsed to the ground. "Go!" Laura shouted, grabbing Jack by the arm and pulling him to his feet. They bolted toward the back of the barn, but as they reached the door, another gunshot rang out. Jack felt the heat of the bullet as it whizzed past his ear, embedding itself in the wooden beam beside him. He ducked, his heart racing. More men poured into the barn, their guns drawn, firing without hesitation. Jack and Laura dove behind the hay bales, returning fire, the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. It was chaos. The men advanced, relentless, their bullets tearing through the fragile wooden walls. Jack's mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline, his hands shaking as he fired round after round, barely aiming, just trying to survive. And then, in the midst of the gunfire, Laura let out a cry of pain. Jack's heart lurched as he turned to see her clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. She had been hit. "Laura!" Jack shouted, crawling toward her, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. But there was no time. The men were closing in, their footsteps heavy, their voices growing louder. "Jack!" Laura's voice was weak, her face pale. "Go!" Jack shook his head, panic surging through him. "No, I'm not leaving you." Laura's eyes softened, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "You have to. Get out of here. They won't stop until it's over." Jack's chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. But deep down, he knew she was right. If he stayed, they were both dead. "Go," Laura whispered again, her voice barely audible. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat, his heart breaking. He stood, his body numb, and with one last glance at Laura, he ran. The barn faded into the distance as Jack sprinted across the field, the sound of gunfire echoing behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All he could do was keep running, keep moving, because that's what Laura would have wanted. But as he disappeared into the night, one thought echoed in his mind. There was no escaping this life. Not really. Not for people like him and Laura. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.